Today I want to tell you something about what we're doing at OpenSocial, planning to move towards Headless. In this talk, I want to discuss what it takes to take an existing Drupal front end and figure out what you need to do to build a decoupled front end with something like React. The talk won't have all the answers. We're also still exploring this ourselves. When I submitted this talk, I hoped we would be a bit ahead of where we are, but we've been working on some other cool stuff. But hopefully this will have most of the questions. It's going to be a high-speed walkthrough of quite a bit of slides to get through. The slides will also be published on my website if you want to review them afterwards. Bit about OpenSocial. OpenSocial is online community building software. We can be used for an intranet or external communities like ideation. We're built on top of Drupal, and some of our customers include Greenpeace, United Nations Development Program, and Victim Support Netherlands. I'm happy to announce that earlier this month we were able to seal an investment from Peak Capital and Nimbus Ventures, and we'll be using that to expand our team as well as innovate in the decoupled space where what I'll be talking about today, as well as with some infrastructure improvements for our SaaS products and moving the OpenSocial distribution to Drupal 9. If you want to help out with that, check out getopensocial.com/jobs for our job opening. First of all, let's address why we want to decouple with OpenSocial. We've built on top of Drupal. This is born out of the existing skills that existed at our company. We were previously a Drupal agency called Gorilla. And OpenSocial started as a project that was a follow-up from a project we did for Greenpeace in Drupal 7. We rebuilt OpenSocial as a separate product in the alpha phase of Drupal 8 about 4 years ago. And we found that Drupal is great for content management, but it's focused around pages. This has worked well for us so far, but where it sometimes falls short is in this example where we're looking at a group as an anonymous user. And what you see here is the stream where you see messages that were posted from the group. And when I scroll down and I want to see something else, I click the About button and the entire page refreshes. But the only thing that has actually changed is the little bit of content in the bottom left that now shows some information about the group. So this is not a great experience because the entire page changing and moving back to the top can be very disruptive. And users have been conditioned to expect smoother experiences by existing social networks like Facebook and Twitter. There's the refreshless module for Drupal, which could help us in this specific scenario, but it only gets us so far. An example where the refreshless module wouldn't be good enough is a mock-up design made by our designer, Xinyu Ma, about what it could look like to have an event page that revolves around a Drupal-based event. At the top here, you see a live video accompanied by a real-time chat. And at the bottom, you see a transcript with a discussion and multiple pages that should be navigatable. In the middle, you also see a submenu that shows different kinds of information about the event. And all of these things should be accessible for a user while the video remains playing and the chat remains accessible. This is not something that's easily accomplished with Twig and jQuery. So that's why we want to build this new front end. There's a few different routes that we can take. And Dries Buitaert has written a great blog post about this that I recommend you check out. This is a flowchart that can take you through looking at your requirements to see where you end up in either using Drupal directly without any JavaScript, all the way to the other side of the spectrum of having Drupal as an API only with a decoupled application that is separate. We've looked at this as well. We see that we need both the editorial needs because we have a lot of site managers that can customize the look and feel of their platform. And we also need some of these developer needs with control over visual presentation, as well as the APIs to support our mobile application. So this flowchart would put you to progressively decoupled, where you take the output rendered by Twig and enhance it with JavaScript. But we see that keeping this in sync, the output of Twig and what something like React expects to start with, becomes increasingly difficult. So we've decided we would go for a fully decoupled app. When we look at what it gives us as an opportunity to build a completely new front end, we can reevaluate some of the choices that we have in our current front end. For example, what browsers we support, what tools we will use, how do we deal with the dynamic content versus what is static, for example, for anonymous users, and how do you exchange that from Drupal, which now does all the rendering, to this separate application. First, we want to look at what are we going to do in terms of browser support and what do we do with JavaScript. One of the decisions that we've made is that for our new front end, we will no longer be supporting Internet Explorer 11. We have been doing so for our existing themes following Drupal core, but we find that it misses too many modern features and the engineering time involved to make everything work doesn't weigh up against the usage. Even Microsoft currently recommends that you use Edge instead, and if you need to use a legacy application that requires Internet Explorer, to use the compatibility mode instead. Swix wrote an excellent article about this topic and how you can deal with customers that still need Internet Explorer 11. In case we have these customers, we can treat the client as an enterprise project and fall back to one of our existing themes that will keep up to date to work with Internet Explorer 11. One of the things that we want to do is understand why the client wants Internet Explorer 11. Maybe we can even convince them that they don't need this in their organization. For JavaScript support, we looked at the experience for anonymous users and the experience for authenticated users. For anonymous users, we've made the decision that all content should be reachable without JavaScript, meaning that we'll require something like static rendering or server-side rendering. This decision has been made so that we're friendly to automated tools like search engines or like web crawlers from Twitter when someone shares a link. The advantage here is that in terms of performance, all the content for anonymous users will be the same, so we can pre-generate it. For authenticated users, the story is slightly different. Open social content is based on relatively complex access rules, like what kind of user you are, what groups you belong to, and this means that we cannot create the pages ahead of time, but need to do quite a bit of calculation. What we want to try to do to offload server loads is to push this personalization to the browser. But that means that we'll have to accept a reduced experience for the minority of people with JavaScript disabled. We find that the number of people with JavaScript disabled has gone down dramatically over the last year. And this is usually a conscious decision. And many more sites these days won't work at all with JavaScript. One thing that we do want to make clear is that we don't want to compromise on accessibility. One thing we see a lot when you start relying on JavaScript to create your front end on the client side is that people reinvent browser native things such as links, breaking functionality to open in a new tab, or focus handling when introducing models. And that's something that we really want to keep an eye on to make sure that that doesn't happen. So knowing that we want to do more in the browser, we need a front-end library to support this. We've chosen for React. The components and the composition that React encourages fits well with our current design process. React components take data in and have declarative output, so they're easy to reason about. And at Open Social, we're already familiar with the React ecosystem. We already have some React components in the Open Social distribution. We also see that React won't cause additional problems with hiring skilled developers. An additional benefit that we see is that we may be able to transfer knowledge to mobile application development in the future. Having said that, something else like Vue or Svelte.js would probably also get you there, but React is just what works for us. With our front-end framework selected, there are some options that we have for languages. In the end, it's all JavaScript because that is what browsers support these days. But there's quite a few ways to get to JavaScript. Writing vanilla JavaScript in a large application such as a SaaS frontend isn't really an option because the amount of bugs that you catch by type checking is well worth the effort of investing in a typed language solution. We have evaluated Flow or TypeScript, but eventually we decided to choose for ReasonML, which compared to the other two is relatively new. The reason that we chose ReasonML is that it doesn't try to improve JavaScript, but instead it uses the OCaml type system to build a separate language that compiles down to JavaScript. This avoids some of the shortcuts that are possible in TypeScript and Flow, or some of the complexities that you have from trying to annotate types on a dynamic language. As a benefit, React is a first-class citizen in ReasonML, so anything we have planned there, we can do. If you want to read a full comparison of the 4 options, then you can find it on my blog. Now that we have our front end figured out, we'll still need to do some of this page generation and server-side rendering. So we need a backend for our front end. It can be tempting to build your own. The basics of server-side rendering or generating static pages aren't that difficult. But what you do see is that once you have these basics down, you want to build some optimizations, then the trouble starts. Besides just building the functionality, you also want to make sure that your developers are productive, so you need to build tooling. I compare it a bit to launching a satellite into space, where your satellite is your front-end product. And instead of just building the satellite, handing it off to SpaceX to put on a rocket, you decide to build your satellite, build your rocket, and build all the scaffolding needed to launch your rocket as well. So let's not ignore the work of larger teams over the past years. This means DIY for us is not an option. One popular contender is to use Gatsby.js, which is great for static websites. I use it for my blog, and it scales well on a content delivery network. The issue for OpenSocial is that these pages are all generated at build time, and a lot of our content is generated by users while our application is running. So this means this is not really an option. The other option we see is Next.js, which seems to be the de facto standard for anything that you want to do slightly dynamic. It provides great tools to decide what should be static, what should be dynamic. And it also recently introduced runtime page regeneration, which means that the user can be given a stale page, but if the content is updated, the page is regenerated in the background. So we've chosen to start experimenting with Next.js, but we're still looking at the options there. If we have our framework, we still need to get the data out of Drupal. Currently, all that happens in Drupal itself and in the theming layer in Twig, but we'll have to build some kind of API to get it out there. So again, here we saw 2 options, GraphQL or the JSON API. We think either can work. We've done a comparison that we haven't published yet, but we do still plan to publish that. Drupal core has chosen the JSON API, and GraphQL in the Drupal contrib space is quite active. We've made the decision to go with GraphQL, mostly because the front-end innovation and React development is leading that way. And the static typing of GraphQL integrates nicely with a language like ReasonML, and the component-based aspects of it integrate nicely with React. So most of the tools available are there. The decisive factor for us was that we saw with JSON API, the load would be put on the front end to call the right endpoints to get the data that's needed. But with GraphQL, the front end can just say, I need this data, and the back end can figure out the most efficient way to get that data for you. As our development team on the back end is larger than on the front end, it makes sense for us to offload that development burden to the back end. So now that we know how we want to build our front end with all the tools and languages available, we also still need to assess whether we actually have the know-how. That's where it's important to look at your team. That's also what we're currently doing internally. If you're still a Drupal agency that's building sites with Twig and PHP and you're looking to go decoupled, you have to realize that JavaScript and the associated frameworks are quite a different technology and have different hosting requirements. And you'll also need to make sure that you think about how you're going to clearly design your APIs so that you don't break them every 2 weeks. You'll have to assess your available knowledge. You may have to retrain existing team members. You may have to hire new team members. But you can also look at consultants just to share some knowledge in specific places where you're missing it. One important aspect is also to assess the time that you have available. We've been working on Open Social for about 4 years now. So we realized that rebuilding all those features in a decoupled front end is going to take quite a bit of time. Once we know how and we have the team in place, we need to start thinking about how we're going to roll this out. One option that we have is to build it all and ship it. This means that we can just sit in our cocoon and build it without having to look at intermediate solutions on working with both the new and the old. But reaching the feature parity of this work we've done in the past 4 years is going to take a long time. And it means that in the meantime, we can't benefit of any of the work we're doing. So unfortunately, this isn't an option as attractive as it may sound to just put your head down and get to work. We'll have to decouple in steps. This means we build some shared components first, maybe like the header and footer, and then figure out, based on paths, what we're going to decouple. This allows a web server to decide whether it sends a request that it gets to the new front end or to the old front end. One of the tools we're using is the weighted shortest job first score. This is a score that's based on the expected user benefit, technical necessity, cost to build, and the cost of delay to figure out what features we're going to build first. Something that's more difficult about doing this in parallel with the existing site is that we need to figure out how this fallback works for the unconverted pages. Do things like session sharing, stuff like that. And there are still some minimum requirements that we'll have to build before we can start shipping this, such as theming and internationalization. One thing that's important to us is the open in Open Social. We are open source at our core, and we've grown thanks to our community. So we want to make sure that we stay faithful to the open source community. If we look at Drupal's model, it's built around modules. Most modules are available for free, but you pay for external services. Premium modules are uncommon, but they're not unprecedented. I don't know if anyone remembers Drupal Gardens, but they had some modules that you could only use on their site. In the case of Open Social SaaS, you pay for our expertise in customization, in hosting and updates, and you pay to get access to some of the extensions that are not available for open source. The JavaScript model is a bit different. The end products are usually closed source. There's no ready-to-go-to distributions like you have in Drupal. And libraries and tools are usually the thing that are open sourced. For example, React and Next.js. And revenue is then made from these end products or hosting. For example, Netlify, Gatsby Cloud, and Vercel all make great React tooling that you can then use on their hosting services. One model that we're looking at, and this is still under debate and very much open to feedback for our JavaScript front end, is that we're going to keep our distribution for Drupal as is. The only thing we will do is move the theme out of the distribution itself into a separate project and make the distribution API first. From the JavaScript side, we'll open source the front-end components and design systems, but probably keep the front-end application proprietary. Of course, while doing this, we will contribute to the tools we use as much as possible. While doing this, we also want to make sure that we keep the community updated. This is very much a work in progress for us. So if you want to know more about this afterwards, you can find us in the Drupal Slack on OpenSocial or in the issue queue, or read our blog at getopensocial.com. You can find me at alexandervarwijk.com, and you can find more about OpenSocial at getopensocial.com. Thank you.
Hi, so we have quite a few questions in the chat room. I'll start from the top. From Ian Finley, do you have percentages on JavaScript disabled?
These studies are hard to come by. We have found some depending on region. I think the most we saw was around 2 to 3%, and especially if you look at the Western Europe and the United States, these percentages drop as well. It'll depend on your type of clients. If you're into municipalities or larger organizations, then this may be a bit different too.
The next question is from Joseph Craig. Can you put any cost numbers or estimates of going decoupled?
That's a difficult one. I think the answer is it depends what you want to replace. If this is something you're building from scratch, in our case, of course, we need to replicate all the functionality that we have now. I expect that in the coming 6 months, we'll probably mostly be working on laying groundwork, figuring out problems before we can actually productively start building features and shipping things. So yeah, it also depends on your team size, of course.
Excellent. So another question from Joseph Craig. Compared to quote-unquote normal websites, when is it appropriate to think about a decoupled solution?
I think our consideration in this is mostly about the level of interactivity that we want to provide. If I look at our marketing website, getopensocial.com, which is also built on Drupal, for now it still works fine because they are mostly pages you just visit. If you look at the things we're running into with OpenSocial, is that we would love to do more interactions without refreshing the page or only changing short things or some things, push-based notifications. Yeah, so I think it's really about the level of interaction without going back to the server that you want to enable.
Next question is from Nigel White. So will Nix.js completely replace Drupal as a backend, or do you keep both in the long term?
Oh, no, we definitely plan to keep both in the long term. So the plan is to have Drupal basically be our data storage. So it'll have the API. And what Next.js does is it is able to pre-render some of our front-end pages. So it acts sort of like a middle between the API and the browser. And then for authenticated users, we very much see that the application that's running in the browser would contact the Drupal API directly to fetch any new data. But for anonymous users or search engines, or maybe even that initial page load for an authenticated user, that's where the Next.js server would come in to build that initial page and then hand that off to the browser.
One more question from Joel Guerin. Is the API something you expect to make public so other people or even clients can make their own applications, for example, mobile apps?
Yeah, so our plan is to build the GraphQL API in the Drupal distribution itself. So that means that it'll be open source. In terms of what we're enabling for our SaaS clients, that'll be something that I think is up to sales. From a technical perspective, we're trying to look at the ability to build our own front end as if it's an external application, so that it would be relatively simple to open this up for other people as well. But if you're using the distribution, we very much expect you to be able to open this API to all your own applications.
Another question from Ian Finlay. I have had problems trying to automate QA of a React-based site. Locator information changes dynamically. Have you seen this issue?
I have not seen this particular issue. What I do think is if you're using things like location or time in your applications, is to try and abstract away the browser APIs that you're using, so that during testing you can switch this out for a mock that you have a bit more control over. That should be something you can look into.
Question from Alex. I've heard Drupal 8/9 might have API performance issues versus a node-based API. Have you considered a node proxy that communicates with Drupal? Or have you not had any performance issues with connecting directly to Drupal?
So we're not at a stage yet where we can say definite things about this. It's been one of our considerations while comparing JSON API to GraphQL. JSON API in that respect is a lot easier because you can use most of the traditional web and HTTP caching mechanisms, and GraphQL requires a bit of its own things. It's something that we've not gotten to run into those problems yet, so we'll have to look into that.
From Corey Sawglass. What does your hosting do? You have one service or?
So currently our open social sites each have their own isolated environments. For the front end, we're still looking at what the best setup are. There are some trade-offs between setting up a separate front end for each client or making something shared in terms of cost, performance, data separation. That was not something I could cover in 20 minutes, unfortunately. But it's something that we're still actively looking at.
Thank you, Alexander, for sharing this talk with us. We are about to proceed to our 15-minute break, but a few announcements first before we go. We have two amazing Ghostmasters, Srijan and Tarzan, waiting to show you the amazing things they're working on. We have special sessions during lunch break at 12:15 today, so don't forget to check them out. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, Scott, have one more question. Can you talk a little about how OpenSocial make use of the group module?
Yeah, so we've actually, I'm happy also to see that Group launched their first stable version, I think also about 2 weeks ago. We've been using it for quite some time now. For us, it's the basis of our group-based functionality. So we have a couple of group types that determine the visibility of users, the group itself, and the content you place in it. So in that sense, they're pretty vanilla in how we use the group module. We also use them for some of our extensions. For example, discussions and courses, I believe underwater are groups as well. That has its benefits and its drawbacks as well. If things expect that to be a group, then it doesn't always conform, but group provides a lot of the functionality that you would expect to be there by default, for example, membership and related content.